Okay, hello, internet people. We're gonna go live soon. Don't worry, we'll just give you a little pan around here.
This was like $300 or $400. Yeah. But I think this will worth it.
This is for the internet.
Hi, Internet!
Hi, internet. These people are on the internet.
I'm gonna get you on.
On the internet. Internet. Do you guys want to say hi to the internet? Say hi to the internet. Say hello to internet people. Internet people, say hello to the internet.
What would you say?
We're decentralizing science one drink at a time. I know. What I say about DeSci is maybe short, yeah. You want to say anything about DeSci? This is for the internet. Yeah.
Live?
Yeah. You want to say anything? No? Okay.
I don't know And it's like the next week.
This is on the internet.
How we doing?
I'm so excited about the oysters.
Why are you excited about the oysters?
Because this
Guy
is a
cleaned
really
the Hudson River.
Because what?
Guy cleaned the Hudson River, you know?
You can, yes. Okay, clean the Hudson River. Okay, cool.
More
What
oysters,
ex-
the cleaner the water.
What?
More oysters, the cleaner the water.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. What excites you about science?
The possibilities,
Cool.
infinite.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to get it.
Harmful
Nice to meet you.
alcohol. What is your name?
Do you want to say anything to the internet? Do you guys want to say anything to the internet? No?
No,
Yes?
I'm good. Thank you. It's my first time here.
First
Yeah.
time? Okay. Do you guys want to say anything to the internet?
Yeah, they want centralization. They want to say something.
Do you want to say anything to the internet?
Hi, Internet.
She'll be speaking later. Do you want to say anything to the internet?
Oh, we're happy to be here, frankly.
These are our speakers for
excited.
tonight. The little internet. Okay.
Yay.
Little, hi, internet.
I was like, I think we should be
Do you guys want to say anything to the internet? Do you guys want to say anything to the internet? No.
It's very
Meeting or selling or
Honestly,
All right, we're gonna start. We're gonna start, and we don't want people to. Okay, we're gonna start. Everyone find a spot. Don't sit here. All right, everyone, find a spot. Awesome. Okay, in the back. Oh, also, if someone could ask the bartender to turn the music off for someone. Guys, in the back, because otherwise we don't have amplification, so everyone's gonna have to actually be quiet. Dor, could you ask the bartender about Dor? Can you raise your hand? You're here. Dor, the bartender. He's got it. He's got. Oh, you got it. Oh, thanks. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Thank you guys all for coming out tonight. It's an amazing turnout. And thank you also to the people on the internet that are also watching. We've started a live stream, and it's great to have people. I'm just going to keep it really short this time. Decentralized science is about making science fun and interesting and making it more open. So if you're interested in that, you can follow us on Twitter, you can tag us, you can follow us on Instagram, and we have an amazing array of videos online. I also started a company called Stadium Science, and that's around making betting fun and interesting. If you're interested in that, you can check it out. That's the people that sponsor it. We work together with them. I think without further ado, we would also like to thank the space. Everyone should get a drink and mention the code that we told you earlier. You get 15% off. Make sure to get a lot of drinks. We're very grateful for the hotel and the event space for being able to host us. And without further ado, we'd like to welcome our Oyster people on stage. They're part of the Oyster project, which is trying to make the Hudson River more clean and also to sequester carbon. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome them. You can get started.
No worries.
Thanks for having us.
So I'm Zeke King-Phillips. I'm the Senior Community Stewardship Coordinator for the Billion Oyster Project. I run one of our community science programs. It's ecological monitoring.
Yeah, and again, thanks so much for having us. Super excited to be here. My name is Cody Herman. I am the Senior Community Science Coordinator at Billion Oyster Project. And much like Zeke, we do a lot of community science and a lot of different ways for non-scientists to engage with science. And we're going to talk to you guys about some of that today. So, show of hands, who's heard of Billion Oyster Project before? Awesome, yay. And show of hands, who has volunteered with Billion Oyster Project at like a corporate volunteering? Okay, yeah, some of you, that's great. So Billion Oyster Project is a nonprofit based in New York City whose main focus is restoring New York's harbor through ecological restoration. So we're really looking at putting oyster reefs in the water, and we want to do that in a really public and participatory way. So we do a lot of public programs and a lot of educational work as well in relation to the ecological restoration work that we do. So really our big goal is we want to put 1 billion oysters in New York City's harbor with 1 million people by the year 2035. And we really need your help to do it, but the good news is we're also on track to do it. So, come join, it'll be fun. We say this a lot, but we do education through restoration and restoration through education. We really have a tight partnership with the New York City Harbor School, which is a public high school located on Governor's Island where our main offices are. And even from a teenage level, a high school level, we're really giving people the tools to get involved with this type of aquaculture industry, fabrication, and all these different types of things. We really love oysters because, they filter water, so they clean the water in the harbor, they provide habitat for other species in the water, and they also provide some protection from storm surge. But what's really so important, but what's so important about the work we do at Billion Oyster Project is really its ability to give people an experience with the harbor and with the water, which historically New Yorkers have been, pretty set back from and pretty separated from. So through our work, people get to engage with the harbor, get their hands dirty, get their hands wet, really see all the life that's in the harbor, and through that, we hope to kind of change the culture in New York City to create more stewards and people that care about keeping our harbor clean. So for our process, one big thing we do is we collect shells. So we're gonna set all these little baby oysters on shells, right? To make reefs, we get those shells from restaurants in the city. So we have a shell collection program that goes around to different restaurants that all of you might eat at. We have about 70 restaurant partners that you can find on our website. We take the shell that they give out to customers and we basically put it on like a giant pile on Governor's Island. If you've done our corporate volunteer days, you might have seen this. But it's like a pile as big as this room, I want to say, right? Really big. The shells go and cure there, so there's no more bacteria in them before they get put into our oyster installations. And some of how we do that is through fabrication. So right now we're producing a lot of reef balls with our volunteer teams. And you know, some of the shell is worked into that concrete that makes those reefs. I don't know, if you volunteer, you can come see it. It's pretty cool. So besides shell collection and fabrication, we also do a lot of oyster production. So once we kind of make these reef balls and other types of loose shell that oysters grow on, we have to raise oysters. So I have one coworker who's always talking about like, oh gosh, I gotta go home. I have millions of lives depending on me. Because we have big shipping containers where we kind of harbor little oyster larvae and hope that they attach to our big reef balls and different pieces of shell and things like that. Once we have our oyster reefs, or our reef balls set with oysters, then we can go and use our boats to deploy them throughout New York City's harbor. So this is actually a picture in Brooklyn Bridge Park. If you've been to, I think it's like the Pier 4 beach, this reef ball with a bunch of baby oysters on it is in the water there with oysters growing today, right now. So exciting. For the last 10 years that Billion Oyster Project has been around, we've been able to put about 19 acres of oyster reef into New York City's harbor, which if you want to think about what 19 acres looks like, it's like double the size of Bryant Park. Bryant Park is about 8 acres, so you know, picture that twice. So our big numbers here is so far we have put more than 150 million oysters back in New York City's harbor over the last 10 years across 19 acres. We have engaged over 20,000 students at different schools and through different education programs and engaged more than 15,000 volunteers. Some of them are you in this room, which is so exciting. And we've diverted over 2.5 million pounds of shell from landfill back into these reefs that we're helping to make. So cool, back to our agenda. We did introductions, we did our Billion Oyster Project info, and here's Zeke with why oysters.
Okay, so I'm gonna cover why oysters. Besides the fact that people like to eat oysters, which I'm sure most of you in this room probably do, although I should mention you cannot eat any of the oysters in New York Harbor. That is simply not safe. We do it, as Cody said, for 3 reasons. The first, this is a really good figure. If anyone's interested, we probably have this on our website. Next one. The first one is water filtration. So a single adult oyster can filter about 50 gallons of water in a day, which is frankly impressive for an animal that's really only about that big. But if you think about a billion oysters, by putting a billion oysters in the harbor, we could filter the entirety of New York Harbor in 3 days, which is frankly very impressive. And super important because, as Cody will talk about later, water quality is one of the other areas that we're really interested in. And there's probably a lot of people in this room, anyone who's been around the city for a while, has been told not to touch the water. And there are certain reasons for that. But oysters, with a billion of them in the water, could really help to remove a lot of the pollutants that we're putting in the water. Specifically, one thing we mentioned here is excess nitrogen. As I'm sure everyone who's interested in climate has heard of, like algal blooms and dead zones, these sort of marine issues that are the result of like runoff of fertilizer and also sewage runoff. These issues can sort of be cleared up by putting a ton of oysters in the water as a nature-based solution. The next one, habitat and biodiversity. There are a ton of associated organisms that sort of end up living wherever an oyster reef pops up, not just because they like oysters like we do, but also for a number of reasons. Very specifically, as part of water filtration, oysters make their own mud. Everything that the oyster doesn't itself want to ingest, doesn't want to digest, they will wrap up in mucus and drop to the bottom of the harbor in what's called a pseudofeces. And so basically that pseudofeces is really good food, unfortunately, for other organisms like worms, like bacteria, that will deal with those sort of unwanted particles and debris. So this is an example of what an oyster reef might look like and a ton of the associated organisms. You can keep going, they're just going to pop up. You have algae, you have the oyster here, obviously, but on the oyster you have an oyster toadfish. You have a bunch of red algae, you have barnacles and tunicates and a lot of these other associated organisms that live in oyster reefs, not just because of that food, but also because these reefs provide, frankly, a great place to, like a coral reef, to rear young, provide safe habitat, places to hide from predators. These are all sort of ecosystem services that oysters provide to other organisms in their habitat.
There's more.
There are so many associated organisms, and this is just a slide to show you a ton of stuff. Will come to the harbor basically if we put a ton of oysters in the harbor to build that habitat. The third thing that oysters do is shoreline protection. Can I get a show of hands? Who's seen Moana? Please. Cool, awesome. So I think basically, usually I put the clip from Moana. I skipped it today because this is an adult crowd. But basically, if anyone remembers the scene from Moana where she's trying to leave the island, she crosses her coral reef and basically immediately falls off her boat and almost dies. Part of the reason that that happens, like the island of Motunui that Moana was from, is protected by its coral reef. A bunch of oyster reefs around New York Harbor would help to protect our coastlines and our archipelago. For anyone who hasn't thought about it, New York is in fact an archipelago. Would help to protect our islands and our shoreline from a lot of the dangerous wave energy that would threaten to basically take away a lot of the soft shoreline. If you think about Staten Island, Jamaica Bay, Long Island Sound, a lot of that is really soft shoreline. It's a lot of beaches, and that's really easily washed away by heavy storms, by heavy wave energy. And so by putting a ton of oyster reefs in the water, instead of waiting 1,000 years for those oyster reefs, this is an example of the living breakwaters off of the coast of Staten Island. If anyone's flown into LaGuardia from a southern approach recently, you might have seen a lot of gray rectangles in the lower harbor. Those are not reefs, but they are foundations of reefs. It's a bunch of rock, it's a bunch of these sort of reef structures that will be seeded with oysters to sort of jumpstart that reef process and protect Staten Island shoreline from that wave energy. Cool. Moving on now, I'm going to explain one of our community science programs. That's the Oyster Research Station program. Oyster research stations, they're about this big, yay big-ish. They're 18 inches by 8 inches by 8 inches. These are what we call in situ laboratories, basically just little structures that allow us to study oysters in their natural habitat. We fill these little metal cages that, as Cody said, are fabricated in-house by our volunteers with up to 200-ish wild, reared oysters, not wild oysters, we rear them ourselves. And basically these structures help us to understand how oysters will fare once we put them in the water. What we use the structures for is basically two things: education and data collection. So we have community members, yes, a bunch of different groups of community members. We have community scientists who are just community members like yourselves, if anyone's super interested and wants to get trained about how to measure oysters, how to understand their mortality, how to survey biodiversity. We have community-based organizations that we work with, like Brooklyn Bridge Park Conservancy, like Hudson River Community Sailing. We have teachers and students. Teachers will use these structures in their classrooms for hands-on science learning directly on the waterfront with their students. And we also have what we call our ambassadors. These are really in-depth volunteers who take it upon themselves, like our community scientists, to go out and measure these structures on their own. The point of doing all of this data collection, either with us or independently, is very specifically to understand the harbor, to connect people with the harbor, but also to contribute to the restoration of a self-sustaining oyster population in New York Harbor. We use the data collected through the Oyster Research Station program to inform our permitting process. And when we're applying to put more oysters in certain places, we'll use this data to say, awesome, it looks like our oysters will grow well here, and we hope that the regulators agree with us. So these are just a bunch of pictures. Some of you are far away but won't be able to see. Basically, just a bunch of examples of different events and different groups of people using the Oyster research stations. Okay, I'm going to cover right now a little bit of the data that we collected this past season, mostly figures, and I'm going to talk through them. These are the sites where we do more intensive data collection for the Oyster Research Station program, specifically with our volunteers. If anyone, I'm sure most of you have stuff to do 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, but if anyone happens to find themselves free on a Monday between 10 and 1, we do regular volunteer events at these sites where people can come with basically no experience and get hands-on experience measuring our oysters and surveying biodiversity. Next slide. This is some of the work that we did this season, basically water quality monitoring to understand what water quality looks like in terms of like the environmental parameters that might control oyster growth around the harbor. The three here are temperature, salinity, and dissolved oxygen, which are three parameters that are sort of known to affect oyster growth. The green bars represent the ideal growing conditions. And basically, as you can see, the dissolved oxygen in New York Harbor always looks great. Sometimes it's remarkably high, which is weird, but great for the oysters. We have our salinity, generally to be expected. This is an estuary. The tide flows in and out twice a day. And then we have our temperature. As you can see, the shoulder months are kind of cold, but like that's also to be expected. It's supposed to get cold in the winter. This is just to show that like New York Harbor really is the ideal place to grow oysters on a small or large scale. So this is what this season looked like at the 6 or 7 sites where we did this data collection. The initial height for each of the groups of oysters at those locations that were put in for this specific purpose is about 20 millimeters, so that's about an inch this season. And we saw remarkable growth, frankly, across all of our sites, the highest growth being at the Baylander. If anyone's been to Baylander, Steel Beach, and West Harlem Piers, you might see some of our cages hanging off the gangwalk there. But basically, across the harbor, really good first year growth. The next one, our new oysters per cage. Not only this season did we see a remarkable growth, but we saw remarkable recruitment. It looks like not only are our oysters doing well, it looks like the oyster population. We talk about oysters perhaps like they haven't been here the entire time for the past 400 years, but they have. There's an oyster population that's doing really, really well up the Hudson, and it looks like perhaps they're spawning, and that's leading to recruitment at some of our sites, particularly as you can see, the Hudson is doing really well in terms of recruitment. There are baby oysters. They are, the adult oysters are reproducing, and those baby oysters are making their way perhaps down the Hudson and growing along the shoreline of Manhattan. Not so much in the East River, but I will say, as you can see in the figure below, there's sort of a reciprocal relationship between recruitment and mortality, just because if you have a lot of oysters dying, it's hard to understand exactly how many oysters, new oysters have appeared. But basically, this is just to say that despite the fact that mortality looks high, this is to be expected. Mortality should be, frankly, upwards of 80% in the first year for most marine invertebrates. So I would say 36, 35% mortality is really good. Next slide.
I'm just going to pause. If there's room in the front over there, because it's really hard to hear here. So everyone who's here in the front, move to the left. Go in and then left. Hit that little go. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a ton of room if anyone wants to move over, particularly the people on the ground who might see better from this side.
Where you can go. If you can't hear, there's space over there where you can.
Okay. This figure is my favorite. It's the only thing, frankly, that I really care about, and it's the biodiversity that we find at our oyster cages. I'm just like a 5-year-old. As soon as I see a fish, I jump on it. But basically, these are our top 5 species and the relative abundance across the season. Some of our sites, there's really no diversity. You're seeing mostly grass shrimp and mud crabs. Frankly, that's to be expected because the salinity of Baylander is so low. It's a little bit high up in Manhattan. But as you can see, we have relatively good diversity. I didn't put the species richness up here. We found about 36 unique species across the harbor this season, so pretty good. Not only are the oysters growing well, but also the biodiversity in the harbor has blossomed, frankly. Cool. Summary slide. A bunch of pictures of cool stuff we found this season. I'm going to go through that first because, like I said, that's the only thing I care about. A black sea bass, a spot fin butterfly fish, which we didn't know you could find in the harbor. A spider crab, which is my favorite thing, and a seahorse. We found 5 of them this season. In case anyone was wondering, there are seahorses in New York Harbor. But just to summarize, we saw impressive first-year growth across all of our sites. We saw mortality rates that were within range, and we saw amazing recruitment in the Hudson River this season. Together, these findings suggest that like restoring an oyster, a healthy, self-sustaining oyster population in New York Harbor is well within our reach. All we frankly have to do is put the oysters in the water. The data from these oyster research stations, as I said, is used to inform our restoration efforts. So if anyone is super, super interested, you can come up to talk to me after this presentation, and I will give you a QR code to sign up for this season. But also, as I said, this information helps us better understand where we should target, which areas of the harbor we should target for like larger restoration efforts in the future. We have a ton of big projects coming up, so if anyone's super, super interested, you can follow along on our Instagram. Cool.
Hi, I'm back. So another side of what we do, again, we talk a lot about oysters, but we really like getting people down to the water and getting people to touch the water. One of the biggest barriers from having New Yorkers come down and play in the water all the time is actually called combined sewage overflow. Do you guys, anybody know what that is? Okay, cool, a couple people. We're about to get into it. But we're gonna talk about the community water quality testing program, and spoiler alert, it's all about human poop in the harbor. So when we talk about water quality, we can be talking about a lot of different things. You know, it could be temperature, dissolved oxygen, other parameters that Zeke just mentioned. Things like oil or petroleum, chemical waste, algae, turbidity, litter, pH, all these things. But today we're really just gonna talk about bacteria. So in the community water quality testing program, which is a community science program that all of you guys could get involved in if you'd like to, we only test for Enterococcus. So Enterococcus is a fecal bacteria. It's found in the intestines of all warm-blooded animals. So that's me, that's you, that's like a goose somewhere, and other mammals, cats, dogs, stuff like that. Enterococcus bacteria isn't necessarily the thing that's going to get you sick, but when you find it in whatever you're testing, it normally means there's poop in there. So when we find Enterococcus in New York's harbor, you kind of start to wonder like, oh no, what is that? Is that a bad thing? And yeah, it is pretty bad. Obviously, when we talk about like being able to swim in New York's harbor, you really need to think about like tides and currents, and are there boats? You know, is it like a physically safe place to be? But the thing that would like make you like poop your pants or vomit in a couple hours would be coming in contact with the sewage bacteria, right? So that's again one of our big barriers from enjoying swimming in the harbor, or even like kayaking. If you think like, oh my god, I might fall out of my kayak and drink like a mouthful of poop water, you know, like that's where you're gonna get sick really quickly, not in like a long-term way from some of the other like more industrial and legacy pollutants. And yeah, if y'all are into bacteria, we test for Enterococcus, not E. coli, just because it lives better in salt water. So, and it looks like that, if you ever wonder. It's a little like, okay. So how does Enterococcus get in the harbor? It's through this thing called combined sewage overflow. So what we have up here is a little diagram. Here is like what happens normally on the left side of the screen. So basically when you flush your toilet at home, it goes into a pipe underground, and that pipe takes your waste to a wastewater treatment plant. And those wastewater treatment plants, they can handle all of the waste in New York City during dry weather. So if it's not raining and you're using the sink at home, you're running your dishwasher, you're taking a shower, you're flushing your toilet, all that water goes into a pipe to a wastewater treatment plant. It's cleaned and put back in the harbor. On a rainy day though, which is what you see on the right side of the screen here, all that rainwater goes into the same pipe as all your wastewater from your home. So it's a combined system, right? A combined pipe. New York City just doesn't have the sewage capacity to take on all that rainwater along with the waste from your guys' homes. So what happens there is that there's simply just not enough room in the pipes. So as little as 1/10 of an inch of rain in an hour can trigger a combined sewage overflow. And that means that after it rains just 1/10 of an inch in an hour, which is a really like tiny amount, right? That's kind of just like wet on the floor type of vibe. That's going to trigger a combined sewage overflow event, and the city will expel raw sewage and unfiltered stormwater straight into New York City's rivers and streams. It sounds kind of crazy, but it's actually pretty common in older cities. I think there are 700 municipalities throughout the U.S. That has this issue, and I see a question.
So where in New York City is that happening exactly?
So, it happens. Staten Island actually has the least of it, believe it or not, because Staten Island was built a little bit later and developed a little bit later. So at that point, people already knew there's an issue with this type of combined sewage system. All of New York City, or 60 to 70% of New York City has a combined sewage system. It's throughout all boroughs. And really the way that it works is there are about 418 combined sewage overflow points. So that's where like that sewage pipe literally meets the shoreline edge. And you could like go look in the tunnel, which eventually like goes back to people's homes, I love it. Don't laugh. It's really cool. I think it's fun. It's really hard to get those maps of where those tunnels are because it's like a homeland security issue. Also, don't joke about the tunnels. You could do a lot in those tunnels. But anyway, all jokes aside, about 27 billion gallons of raw sewage and stormwater are expelled into New York City's harbor every year. 27 billion. It's a lot. We can go to the next slide. And just a quick shout out to geese, because geese also poop a lot on like the beaches where you might want to launch your kayak or like wade into the water. And again, they're like warm-blooded, they have enterococcus too. So sometimes it's just like, we don't know if it's human poop or goose poop, but it's the poop that'll make you vomit if it gets in your mouth anyway. Next slide. So again, some things we just went over. How does enterococcus get into the harbor? New York City has a wastewater and a stormwater problem. So New York City's sewer system pollutes the harbor. About 60 to 70% of New York City has a combined sewage system underneath it, like I mentioned, and I can show you guys some maps as to figure out where you fit in all of this and where your toilet flushes to later. We kind of already went through a lot of this. So the other 30 to 40% of New York City has what they call an MS4, and that's where like the sewage pipes are separated underground, so no matter if it's dry weather or wet weather, your toilet flush is going to go to the wastewater treatment plant. But in those areas, which is about half of Staten Island also, just for fun so you know, those areas, any litter that you throw on the street, or anytime like a dog poops and somebody doesn't pick it up and then it rains, all of that gets caught up in the stormwater and flows into a storm drain is always going to expel directly to the harbor. So there's really like no perfect solution when it comes to this stormwater issue. And as we see more rain from climate change, and as we see more people living in the city, more water lines, more toilet flushes, it's actually a really complex problem to try to think about. New York City's harbor is unarguably the cleanest it's ever been, but when we look at an issue like sewage pollution, it starts to get a little more complicated. Oh, and then 5% of the city has direct drainage, so those are like the homes in Howard Beach where the toilet just goes straight into the harbor. But we don't talk about that. I don't want to disrupt what they got going on. That's the secret stuff. Okay, so, how can we mitigate this issue? What can we do? It really comes down to upgrades to wastewater treatment facilities, right? You're not going to be able to stop that water from going into the harbor unless your pipes are big enough. And there are a bunch of other things we could do, like retention of stormwater and sewage. So that's essentially just like big storage tanks called gray infrastructure. Have y'all heard in Gowanus about this big sewage storage tank infrastructure project? So this is kind of a picture, and you can see the scale of it. So this is like a huge work truck. That's like a little cat excavator. And this giant pit that's ultimately going to hold, I think, 12 million gallons of sewage and stormwater during rain events, which is going to stop a lot of the sewage overflow from a place from going into the Gowanus Canal. And then you also have the detention of stormwater is another thing that can really help this problem. So have you guys seen rain gardens on the sides of the roads? So there's like a little curb cut. I see a lot of head nods. We love that. So these rain gardens are actually really important to stopping your poop from going into the harbor during rainstorms. Each one of these gardens can hold about 5,000 gallons of water underneath it, and that water slowly seeps back into the earth instead of going into our wastewater system and overloading it. So every one of these is taking 5,000 gallons out of the wastewater system, which is greatening the capacity to treat actual sewage. which again is it's just gross to have the poop water in the harbor, right? So one rain garden at a time, right? Or really big infrastructure projects. So that is to say, in the meantime, while we wait for these big infrastructure projects or some of these smaller piecemeal infrastructure projects like rain gardens, we can test the water, right? And we can create that data to understand which places are polluted, which places need that infrastructure investment, which places need more rain gardens, and really kind of understand where advocates can help make the harbor cleaner. So that's a picture of our water quality jar and stuff. This is the vibe, if you want to do it. Little gloved hand, little jar. Could be you. So the community water quality testing, why do we do this and what are we doing? So in 2012, the New York City Water Trails Association started this water sampling program. It was really a bunch of boaters and kayakers that wanted to focus on bacteria testing near public access points and the shoreline edge. So places that people might fall in. Places where people, might be exposed to that bacteria. And over our 13 seasons, we have collected over 12,000 samples at over 140 different locations. And again, this is really all just community scientists. I was a community scientist volunteering for this program for like 7 years before I got my real job, which is always exciting. But a lot of people have put a lot of time into this program and created a really beautiful data set that anybody can use and is totally public. It really fills in gaps left behind by the testing programs that the state, the feds, and the city have set up. They really don't make that data publicly available. So if you're a kayaker and it just rained on Thursday and you're kind of like, damn, I don't know if it's too gross to go kayak this week, the city and the state and the feds don't really provide that data for you. So that's why this group of boaters was really like, wait, we have to take things into our own hands and start collecting this data. And yeah, historically we compare our bacteria data to the same standards that the New York City Health Department uses for beaches. So if a beach is open, it's because it has passed the bacteria standards of the New York City Health Department that day. And that's kind of what we judge our data on, even though a lot of the places, aren't really safe to swim because it's like a ferry stop or something. But we know that there are kayakers and people that are using the water, so it's still super important to know. So what we do is every Thursday morning, again, this is for like the last 13 years now, every Thursday morning, a bunch of people go out and collect these Enterococcus samples in these little jars. This is a nice picture of Brooklyn Bridge Park also. And on Thursday afternoon, they drop those samples off to the labs. They process in an incubator for 24 hours. Friday afternoon, we get our results, and we send out a big newsletter, which I hope you guys subscribe to, on Friday afternoons or Friday evenings. And that means you get your results about bacteria right before you're ready to go do your weekend recreation, right? So again, this whole timing of the project and everything we do is really centered around getting people into the water safely. Some of our water quality partners, really all your faves are here. There's really a lot of organizations that have worked with this program over the history of its life, and we're always looking for new organizations to get involved too. So if you work in or around a park and you don't know if there is sampling or whatever, we want to hang out, we want to play, we want everybody on the water to kind of be taking in data about combined sewage overflow. So we use what we call the IDEX Entero alert system. So it's really easy. It's like the only way to test for Enterococcus bacteria that's EPA approved and only takes a day. Other things take like about a week, the membrane filtration and stuff, which kind of sucks because you want to know if you can go swimming or boating like now, right? You don't want to wait a week for results and then be like, oh, I guess the water quality was good last Friday. I can totally go out this Saturday. It just doesn't make as much sense. So this IDEX Enter Alert system has really helped us be able to get more rapid results in a cheap way. Ultimately it's not that expensive. And what's really cool about IDEX's little patented Enter Alert system is that when the bacteria incubates overnight and eats the reagent that we mix with the sample, it then glows under black light. So it's like a little party moment. I'm always like, I want to have the Enterococcus party with the black lights. But basically we put all of the samples in these trays and then we count the glowing wells to determine the number of bacteria in that sample. We share the data so that swimmers and kayakers and boaters can all, understand kind of what they're getting into. We color code the data. Green means go, right? That means the New York City Health Department would be like, you can totally swim here. Yellow means definitely use caution. The way that I interpret this yellow kind of intermediate level is like if you've recently undergone chemotherapy or you have an autoimmune disease or you're a little older with a weaker immune system, that water might not be good for you. If you're young and healthy, you could probably get away with getting a little splash and like feel no pain. And then the red, that's totally like user discretion. If you like fell into that water, you very well might get a rash or you might get sick or something like that because the concentrations of poop, the health department says you shouldn't put your face in it. That's kind of, they're like, can you submerge your body in it? Can you put like your face holes in it? Health department said do not do that. But I think, the yellow and the green is kind of like a know your body, know your limits type of reading. And red is definitely beware. We can also take our data and compare it to state and federal result standards as well, which we'll look at in a second. But for the most part, we really look at the health department standards because that's kind of like the short term, are you going to be okay if you fall in type of stuff. We have a site map, so you can go see all our sites and all our data by site. This is what the data sheets look like. They'll show you some other information like sample time and like the rainfall that week in Central Park. And with all that information, you can kind of determine the trends per site or just like if it's cool for you to go kayaking that day and how careful you need to be about coming in contact with the water. So last year, about half of our samples came back not safe for swimming, which could be alarming, but also it's a community science project, right? So a lot of places that people have chosen to sample are actually like really disgusting places that need a lot of love and attention. It just so happens that people are really interested in like polluted waterways like Newtown Creek and the Gowanus Canal. People love these waterways, which is great because they need a lot of love to kind of come back to be healthy and functioning ecosystems. Places like the East River, places like the Hudson River, we don't necessarily have as many samples from because, people are a little less interested in these water bodies that, get love and are like more well represented. However, if we compare 2024 to 2023, we see a really big jump in the amount of bad samples we saw in 2024, which is kind of strange because we actually had less rainfall. So, there's a lot that can go into these results, but fun to analyze if any of y'all are into data analysis and models and things like that. How is this happening? Why is this happening? You can go to the next slide. So we also really break down the geometric means of what we call the MPN. When we read our little blacklit trays of water, it gives us a number that's kind of like a, oh goodness, I'm blanking. CFU. Is that it? Yeah, so CFU, that's like if it grows on a petri dish is CFU, and we just kind of like have our medium suspended in this tray, so they measure it in MPN, but it's the same as like CFU if you think about it that way. Yeah, these geometric means are like the easiest way to really look and understand the quality of your sample site. We did not see a lot of good geometric means this past year. In 2023, it was really split like evenly. We have about 90 sites per year. Areas with open water with more current, like the East River and the Hudson River, we see much better water quality. Whereas when you go to these smaller tributaries that are narrow, that don't have as much current, like Newtown Creek, Westchester Creek, the Bronx River, Flushing Creek, Coney Island Creek, you see much worse water quality results there. So, for example, last year, the best site that we saw in New York City was Hudson River Pier 40, which is where the river project is. Maybe y'all have been there as well. Really good water quality. Most samples that we took there were like safe for swimming. Whereas the worst site that we saw in New York City this past year was in Newtown Creek and Dutch Kills, which is the little creek that curves around the back end of Long Island City. Really funky in there, right? It's like this far away tidal tributary. The clean water from the East River doesn't really get that far up to flush that sewage overflow out. It's kind of a common story and kind of predictable. And this is comparing our water quality to the state standards. So you can see where we're not meeting city standards, we're also not meeting state standards. This basically means that the city, in the fact that it, puts out this 27 billion gallons of raw sewage every year, is non-compliant to state standards and to federal standards. They basically just pay a fine every year, and that's how we deal with it. There's a lot of room in this space for more policy advocacy, and really a lot of things we can ask from regulators to help us, make things match up a little bit more, and have realistic standards for maybe what is expected, or standards that actually might feel attainable or a path to get there. Lots of room. So if you want to talk more about it, we should. And of course, does New York City need cleaner water? What do you guys think? Nice. So, we really need cleaner water because of the EPA Clean Water Act. It says all water bodies in America should be swimmable and fishable. Zeke said you can't eat the oysters around here, right? So it's not really fishable. You can't really swim in the water because you might eat human poop and vomit, so we're not there, right? So of course we need cleaner water. But without big investments in that green and gray infrastructure, it's going to be really, really hard to tackle this sewage infrastructure problem. And it's really only going to get worse due to climate change, right? We're getting more and more rainfall, but also because of increased population in New York City too, it's also another thing that's making this a little more challenging to mitigate. Another thing to think about is as extreme heat becomes more and more of an issue in New York City, you're gonna inevitably see people turning to the harbor as a place to cool down. If that water is full of harmful bacteria, those people, not only are they gonna be really, really hot to the point where, their lives may be in danger, they'll also be coming in contact with this harmful bacteria, and might not know about it. They might not even know that they're exposing themselves to that when they go to the water to cool down. So this sewage issue is really, an environmental justice issue, a climate justice issue, and something that we as New Yorkers really need to think about when we think about, equity in the face of climate change. Some research and information for you. So the New York City Department of Environmental Protection has a map for the MS4 areas. If you want to see if your poop does not go into the harbor, look up the DEP MS4 map. If you are interested in finding the combined sewage overflow that your poop goes into when it rains, which I highly recommend you do, and you go visit it and you start to understand where a little part of you lives out in the harbor potentially, you can go to Open Sewer Atlas. It's hosted on a Tumblr, so this is like an old school vibe. So find the Open Sewer Atlas Tumblr. There will be a map that you can go to there. You can type in your address and see, where your poop flushes to when it rains. And then of course you can look at the Department of Environmental Protection's map of CSOs, which doesn't show you all of them, but it shows you the big bad ones, and most of them are in those tiny little channels and tributaries that we talked about earlier that have bad water quality because of lack of current. So you'll see that they're in Flushing Bay, Flushing Creek, the Bronx River, Bowery Bay, Westchester Creek, the Harlem River, Newtown Creek, Powdergate Basin. All of these are really tiny channels with not a lot of shoreline that are just getting totally blasted by human poop during rainstorms. Really something to think about and look at when thinking again about equity and infrastructure and development. If you want to stay in touch with us, and I think these QR codes may or may not work because the thing's a little out of focus, but let me know. You can subscribe to our newsletter so you can get all the latest sewage news and also our water quality results once the season starts up. And you can also become a water sampler. If you want to become a water sampler, on the right over there's a form, an intake form, and I will email you back and we'll try to find you a place to sample this year. And I can give you this presentation 3 more times throughout the year because it's my favorite thing. Cool. Other ways to get involved with Billion Oyster Project outside of sewage pollution, of course you can come volunteer. Again, a lot of those fabrication projects that we talked about, whether it's building the oyster research cages that Zeke talked to you about or helping to fabricate reef balls. We have events to do all those things. You can visit one of our shell collection restaurants. So all of our restaurants are listed on our website as well, bop.nyc, real easy. You can find one of our restaurants, again, 70 restaurants where you can eat at, knowing that those shells will go into a future restoration project and stay out of landfills. 80. Now we have 80 restaurants. We've been coming back since the pandemic. It's been a slow crawl, but I think we're so back. You can also donate to Billion Oyster Project. Of course, we love that. Fund the work we do. You can check out other events. We have a great events page. Get involved with not just the programs Zeke and I have told you about, but tons of other monitor opportunities that other staff do. Of course, you can join a community science program like me and Zeke just spoke to you about. And probably the most fun option is coming to the Billion Oyster Party. You got any hot take on this?
The Billion Oyster Party is fun. The ticket price is $200, but it is unlimited oysters all night, so you can probably wait.
Open bar, open oysters. It's in September every year, and it's a good party. It's kind of like a Brooklyn warehouse in the Navy Yard, but like oysters. Just packed, door to door. Like all you can do is eat oysters and hang out. So I hope to see you guys at the party. And yeah, I think we did it. It's time for questions.
Hi, yeah.
For the Oyster Project, could you explore deploying the seaweed to double the bioremediation and share the permitting process and water testing?
Yeah, so you mean, the question for everyone who cannot hear was, have we thought about deploying with seaweed? You mean putting the oysters on seaweed?
Or you might.
Yeah.
Or a joint multi-stroke with aquaculture as well as designs and arrays of seaweed in between.
We haven't done that, but there is a new nonprofit, Seaweed City, that's also working on Governor's Island. That's been seeding lines out in Newtown Creek and around Governor's Island as well. You know, if their habitat is making habitat and our habitat is making habitat, it's gonna be great. We have worked with Seaweed City a little bit, just helping them like with their lines on Governor's Island, but we ourselves haven't incorporated it into our designs.
Is there any desire for sampling
Offshore?
Offshore would be very interesting. If you happen to be able to take an offshore sample every Thursday morning, it's rough.
Saturday mornings?
Not so much. Again, because we're this specific program we do a lot of Thursdays. Huh?
Wednesday nights?
Wednesday nights? We can talk about it. We can figure it out. But again, we're kind of on like a strict Thursday schedule because we have this Friday newsletter vibes. You know, I didn't make the rules. It's just how it is. But we do need to kind of come up with ways to expand the program based on people's capacity.
Are there any other, besides like August, are there any other chemical proxies for sewage in the water column you actually look for real time that might be useful?
Real time.
Or real time, yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, you tend to see a lot. Oh, sorry. So asking, besides enterococcus bacteria, are there other indicators you can look for fecal pollution, kind of on a more short-term scale? Dissolved oxygen typically relates a lot to the amount of sewage, just because those nutrients are going to cause algae to grow, and then the algae is going to kind of deplete your dissolved oxygen levels in a lot of cases. In super polluted tributaries, you'll see bad DO that might pair with that well. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
There's a good body of work about diseases at oysters in addition to like filtering the water. Because they filter the water, they're also a really big repository for things like, you can find drugs in oysters that like pass out of us and into them. You can find diseases in oysters. So there are, it doesn't measure the quantity in real time, but you can see like what is passing out of us and into our ecosystem through oysters. Not as helpful as enterococcus, but another option.
You can also test for things like soap, you know, because if you see soap in the water, again, that's probably waste from a home. Should we work this way or should we start on the other side?
Sure.
I don't know, where are we? You're right in front of me.
So if the real cause of this is due to the rainfall and the wastewater getting out, why focus on oysters as they seem like some sort of secondary thing when even in your presentation you mentioned like the gray water infrastructure or I forgot what it's called, the green, you know, so like don't want to solve those problems before we start focusing on oysters?
Oysters love eating poop. So we're really lucky. Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting to repeat the question. The question was, should we be focusing more on the sewage pollution issue than the oyster issue, and focusing more on infrastructure improvements than natural or nature-based solutions? And I think there's definitely a balance to it. To be quite frank, Billion Oyster Project started with this mission of education through restoration and producing oyster reefs. Not so much on the water quality zone, it kind of came in after. But again, it's really related to our mission of, providing access to the harbor.
Yeah, I think my big point is that it is significantly cheaper for us to just put oysters in the water than for the city to spend a lot of billions of dollars. We're talking like 10, 20 billion to fix the problem. I think perhaps, it's us doing the oyster restoration. Like we, as a community, as an organization, don't have the funds to fix that issue. I also would say like the gray water infrastructure in Gowanus has cost, 10, 20, 30 million dollars, which is the amount that it would cost us to put probably about 300 million oysters in the water. So I think like it's really a cost issue. And also, like Cody said, how we came into this.
Yeah, you guys talked a lot about like sewage pollution, but how big is, say, the other pollutants that you guys talked about? Maybe like harmful industrial chemicals or oil or such. Are they as big of a problem as sewage, or?
Yeah. So the question was about legacy chemicals, not sewage pollution, but like PCBs and PFAS and all of those other heavy metals, the chemical pollutants that like were dumped into the harbor for literally hundreds of years. Those are quite honestly still there. They are just at the bottom of the harbor, buried in the mud. So the Army Corps of Engineers, I believe, was looking at specifically around ferry docks, the remobilization of a lot of that sediment as remobilizing those pollutants. We focus specifically on Enterococcus, as Cody said, because like we inherited this health issue. In terms of the ability to oysters to deal with those pollutants, probably not as good, but I think, they're all there. There are like tens of feet, upwards of 30 feet of mud that is just pollutant laden at the bottom of the harbor, so much so that the solution, very frankly, is to put cement on top and just hope it doesn't move. I think it would require much more money and effort in terms of remediation than anything this city or this country or this state is ever going to put into like fixing the problem, is my personal feeling about that.
We're lucky that people don't just illegally dump like they used to. The harbor is so much cleaner than it was, and that's because, we built more wastewater treatment plants, but also the culture and regulation around like industrial dumping. It just doesn't happen the way that it did before. So now it's not like petroleum leaks that are stopping us from enjoying our harbor. It really is more this like infrastructure issue with the sewage.
Can you talk about the distribution and allocation of the billion oysters? Are you allocating them to the heavily polluted area more than the Hudson River? Breaking down like
Yeah, so we have about a dozen reefs right now. The question was about the allocation of oysters around the harbor. Are we focusing on heavily polluted areas? We have about a dozen reefs that are scattered around. Once again, to be quite frank, I think the location of those reefs is based on where the oysters will do best, which isn't necessarily aligned with the most heavily polluted areas. Not to say that oysters wouldn't do well in heavily polluted areas. My personal opinion is that they actually love living in sewer outflows because it's just more food for them, gross as that is. But in terms of where we've done our work, it's mainly in areas that we know our oysters will grow well, or there are other interests, like community interests, or financial interests. So we have reefs like Soundview by the ferry terminal, which is up near City Island in the Bronx, near Bronx Neck, Jamaica Bay, and it really is just about like where they grow and where they'll grow best. And also where the state will let us put the oysters, that's also a very big concern. They really won't let us put them anywhere that's like too heavily polluted, too close to large sewer outflows, because of concerns about sort of the oysters and the environment and poaching and adjustment. So.
Yeah, I think the state actually discourages us from putting them too close to these highly polluted water bodies because we know that people probably will eat these oysters. So it's kind of, I think we call it an attractive nuisance. Typically, where these oysters are probably going to attract people doing things we don't want to do with them, like eating them.
Is the type of oysters that you guys change how much water can be filtered, or are there any specific species that you guys use?
So we only work with the eastern oyster, which is what's native to the harbor. Before colonization, the eastern oyster in New York City used to be like as ubiquitous as like a hot dog cart. So people used to just be like selling oysters on the corner for cheap because the eastern oyster used to do so well here.
Yeah, I will say there's only one species of oyster on the East Coast, and that is the eastern oyster, Crossatrea virginica. So if you ever eat an oyster from somewhere else, it's the same species. It's just like the water quality and different characteristics make it look different. But yeah, as Cody said, we're focused on like restoration of that former ecosystem. There are other projects, like Chesapeake Bay, I know at the beginning was looking at Crossatrea gigantica, which is another species of oyster that we won't deal with, but because we only have one native species, I think that's like the preference not only for us, but also, I'm going to be so honest, I don't think regulators would like us putting a non-native species in the harbor. Yeah.
What is your favorite fun fact about oysters?
My favorite is Zeke's important fourth thing that they do that we didn't talk about yet.
No, it's actually, okay, so my secret
the question was, what's your favorite oyster fun fact?
My favorite oyster fun fact is that some people think about oysters potentially as a sink for carbon, just because they incorporate CO2 into the shells when they create their shells. Oyster shells are made of calcium carbonate, which is three things: calcium, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. So it is potentially a sink for carbon. I can't be quoted on that because we don't have a number. I guess that's the reason. Mine is that one of the theories about how Typhoid Mary got her typhoid is actually from eating bad oysters, just because as we pass sort of, as I've said, drugs, diseases, all of those things go into the harbor. Oysters eat those, and they can live in oysters for a period of time that I can't personally quantify. So we have researchers who've reached out because they're interested in looking at like the presence of COVID and pneumonia in oysters as ways of tracking like the presence of those diseases in the city. So yeah, typhoid and oysters passed to Mary, and then hundreds of people after her.
That's a good one.
I have a question. Do you have any genetic or genomic data for these guys, or
the question was, do we have any genetic or genomic data from the oysters in terms of
ones that do better, that survive in different areas?
Yeah. So I'm not super familiar. My first inclination would be to say that the genetic span, because we buy all of our oysters from hatcheries, right? So the genetic diversity between different hatcheries, because you're looking at the same species, I'm not entirely sure it's wide enough to provide any certain advantages. But I will say, in terms of where our oysters come from, there has been some, in terms of the recruited oysters that I talked about, there's been some interest from some of our external partners in looking at whether the oysters that are recruited in some of the sort of leg shell bags we put out or some of the cages we put out are coming from the wild oyster population that's further up on the Hudson, or from our aquaculture population that we put in the water. I have heard tell, as in I've read the paper by Matt Hare at Cornell, who said that the upstream population is not providing any larvae to like downstream, so like they'll spawn, but they're not making their way down here. I don't know if I believe that, but that's what I can say about the genetics for oysters. Sorry.
Yeah, I just had a question. So I know you're not eating any of these oysters, but do you have thoughts on microplastics, nanoplastics that are in the oysters? Because I personally stopped eating seafood because of all the microplastics in seafood, and particularly in oysters.
The question was about microplastics and oysters, and are we worried about it? And I'm so glad you asked, because last year our intern did a project on microplastics and oysters.
Yeah, I will say, I don't mean to scare anyone, I read a couple of papers today about quite literally microplastics in not just oysters but also seafood. I think the most recent review that I read said about 60% of global fish populations probably have microplastics in them, and 94% of oysters globally have microplastics. And that's a combination of like micro beads and micro threads. So whenever you wash your clothes, if you're wearing an acrylic, a polyester, a synthetic, frankly, you're shedding microplastics. Those do end up in our oysters, especially with our sewage system as it is. Anything that ends up in the water does end up in oysters. So yeah, oysters are a repository for plastics as well. But to be quite frank, all of us have plastics inside of us anyway, so yeah.
But even when, we had a high school intern last year and we just had them like cut open some oysters and just look under a microscope. It was pretty lo-fi, it was like super simple stuff. And even he was able to like clearly identify like fibers and plastic beads, like all these different shapes that, you don't really find in nature. It was very obvious, like, oh, that's a plastic or that, So even just at a glance, a 16-year-old can find a microplastic in your oyster.
Oh, can we make our oysters make pearls? I get this question a lot, so thank you for asking. The Eastern oyster does not actually make pearls. I will say I've seen their attempt at a pearl. It's kind of gross, it's kind of chalky, and instead of being encased in flesh like with the Western oyster, I think the Seminole oyster makes pearls, but don't quote me on that. Instead of making a pearl, they'll like attach it to their shell as a nodule. So even if it was pretty and made of the same like nacre, you probably couldn't get it off. Yeah. So they do not, unfortunately, make pearls.
The way that like pearls normally work is like while they're filtering, they'll get like a little piece of debris in them and then build up that pearly outside around that piece of debris. With the Eastern oyster, they kind of just like push it to the top of their shell, and that's why they're kind of lumpy and freaky looking. Which I just think is so New York at the end of the day.
Hello. What's our score? How many oysters out of a million?
Yeah, we're
150 million.
Ooh. Yes, 150 million. This summer, I'm gonna say we'll probably do 50 to 70 million. I haven't looked at our pipeline, but we'll probably top 200 by the end of the year. And we have plans to scale up very big, very fast. So we'll get there. We have 10 years, so.
Yeah, basically I think over the next 10 years, we're trying to put about 100 million more oysters in every season, roughly, to get to our goal in 10 years.
Yeah, what's the limiting factor in how many oysters you can do in the summer? What is scaling up look like?
Yeah, I think the question was what does scaling up look like in oyster production? I think, obviously funding is a big issue. It costs a lot of money, not necessarily to like take care of the oysters, but to do those deployments. It's a lot of boats, it's a lot of moving people around, it's a lot of labor, and a lot of time permitting things, and that can kind of get wonky. Also, baby oysters are kind of hard to keep alive. The larval stage, we kind of had massive die-offs this last year, right?
Yeah. So the die-offs that we saw last season weren't just our oysters, like we're not just killing them. Our hatcheries actually had a bunch of crashes. I'm not entirely sure what happened, but frankly, if oysters got more expensive last year, it's probably because of that. The other thing I'll say is permitting. Regulators really are only comfortable with a certain amount of oysters at a time. That's totally understandable, so we're not just like overwhelming the ecosystem, but we do have to come to an agreement with how many we can put in the water with the regulators, and I think that's also a factor.
Are the oysters taking food from anyone else? If regulators are limiting the amount of oysters, what do more oysters negatively impact?
The question was, what would be the negative impacts of putting more oysters in the water? Are they taking up space or food from other organisms?
I think it's just that, again, dealing with oysters in New York City's water is very difficult for regulators because you want to protect people that might be eating them. So these big influxes, I think, are also like, how do we survey and manage and make sure that populations aren't eating oysters, and the more that you're putting in, the more you have to do of that.
Yeah, so what I'll say, there is not The oysters are really lucky in that we have eaten so many oysters and like decimated the population in the harbor over the past 400 years so much that like when we put oysters in the water, it's sort of an innovation. We call it habitat uplift. There's not really competition for food. There's not really competition for space because we are creating new habitat basically. The only other really large-scale ubiquitous bivalves in the harbor are mussels, which aren't really occupying the same niche. So yeah, there's not a ton of competition between oysters and other organisms.
You did mention a lot about like the mortality rates, and was one of the goals to eventually have them reproducing themselves and like thriving their own organisms, or like organically reproducing, or is it something that you feel like a billion at the end of the road might not be enough? We'll have to do a little bit more to keep on pushing to make the Oyster River safe and clean.
Yeah. So the question was about mortality and about whether our goal is a self-sustaining or a reproducing population. We say self-sustaining population is our goal very specifically because we do want them to reproduce, but also we are the Billion Oyster Project, and that billion number is just the number we're going to dump into the water. That doesn't count the wild oysters that are already there, that we have evidence they're reproducing. We see new baby oysters every year. We saw recruitment in the cages. So they're doing super, super well. It takes about 2 to 3 years before an oyster is ready to reproduce. So the oysters we put in last year won't be able to reproduce until next year. So if there are sort of large-scale impacts in terms of like the amount of larvae being pumped into the water by our oysters, it takes a couple of years for that to happen. But as I said, there is evidence that the oysters that are in the water, whether they're ours or whether they're the native oysters, are already reproducing. So basically what we're trying to do is just give the population a jump start. We're trying to put 1 billion more oysters in the water. We don't have a quantification or like a number right now on how many are already there across the whole harbor, but like that billion should help to jumpstart the formation of a new large-scale ecosystem scale population.
And lately we've been looking at places where wild oysters already exist and understanding, how we can help those reproducing populations kind of like move a little past where they already are. And then, the spat and larva from that reef, maybe it finds its way over across the East River to like another installation we have. And like those communities all throughout the harbor can start to support each other.
Anyone else?
Did we do it?
Awesome.
Yay, thanks
What happens after you get a billion oysters?
Honestly, I hope I still have a job.
Oh wait, one second. Oh.
Present for you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you all for coming.
Great audience. Cool spot.
Thank you for the amazing talk.
We are really big into trail.
We got you a DeSciNYC mug, so it's a beaker. Yes, and thank you guys for the talk. So let's give them a round of
Wow, should I use this in the
Yeah, of course, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, you guys can all chill, enjoy, get some more drinks at the bar. Yeah, that's all. Thank you guys.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course. Oh, thank you.
Okay, so flushing actually gets me started because this is like my real bread and butter is so flushing if you think about like 6 miles of shoreline, it has 6 really big combined systems. It takes on 12
Thank you guys. Thanks for meeting.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. Thanks for coming, you guys. So we'll do a test.
That's why it's so bad in Washington, is because like catchment areas alongside of that big park, District Meadows, like everybody I've ever met in my life, like in Russian, there's one in College Point, but again, it's just really like the size of the population and the lack of free it's just
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Thank
you.
Push it. Yeah, there's definitely opportunities like voiceovers to do like Oyster monitoring that we was talking about. If you're in like Northeast Queens, I think that would be help. Yeah, you live in Victoria. But if you can get out to we got it from she found this great name there. Those oyster yes, yeah. So really good for students. Or just adults interested in getting their hands on but that's something that I'm born in the 90s, so we can catch up with all these changes. But yeah, I would Boy Scout. Yeah.
We had a break. The things that will people will pay money for is like the rumor that like certain Subway sandwich shops without selling fresh baked bread, they like to walk by and and I don't know what I'm like really bad
That's why I do follow
I was writing my questions, so I was like, oh, this would be sick. I was trying to formulate it. I'm like, well, how am I gonna get that text working? It's never like, it's already on I'm praying that I get paid, but I should be on severance for the next 8 months. So it's reduced to so it's not like and I did. No, I'm not going to figure it out.
Oh, yes. How did I get the what? That was one email. I just emailed him.
It's the shittiest one.
Oh, it was great. It was all. It's also online if you want to watch it. Yeah.
drinks? Yeah. Where do you practice? So I have some very targeted questions. So I also have New York City students, but some people are out on water every single day. Because we're literally in the water all the time. We go all the way to the bridge. Yeah. So we have a lot of sites covered historically. We do one at Pier 1, where the Stratford is walking around. We have one that's public. We have one in Columbus, and that's water. Which is kind of like where the money transfer station is, like a little bit north of the city. And then we have some water national parks. Yes. I was trying to tell them. But they're hard to find whether they might be is that cultures. So we have numerous labs. Normally, if you're testing out down there, you like to be there. So every day there's so much. But yeah, if you wanted to go out to College Point, I'm serious. I'm ready to start on the fastest better for Seattle. You know, that's my brain is he would love to talk about it. I agree. We're very much in line with like, never enough cities going to have their we are always going to have a lot of it down. So, do something at the top. That would be something. I'm personally investing a lot of
What are the things that you're sampling? Like
got it. That would be like, where we there. We have Oyster that the Empire Dragon team has What is there an opportunity, again, as a Chinese student, we're very attention to how to stack education others because the regular are cultural festivals. And then is there working with the city? Like, who's in charge of signing? I think that would probably be the city that's like coming down on like the winter, like that would be the that's something I mean, we love parties, like, every once in a while we provide is that how you got Guardians or Guardians was started, I think the first one was problem myself, and they were kind of like, so they were like, Empire was starting to do whatever they used to do. And then it was right time. So that's, yeah, and then it was, we got water quality volunteering and everything like social media is my yeah. I was like so fucking freaked out, but it's like all day. I just like keep on the street. I want like National Geographic or something like that.
It's like a diversity.
Yeah. No one cares that like a pretty big portion of like the main U.S. actually that anymore. also hooked up, it's like out of that 27 million gallons of distribution that goes into the harbor, 12 million of it goes into luxuries. So you're getting a incredibly disproportionate amount. It's like,
It's just so funny because it's like, we're literally, and we also like,
that's true.
you were also
Me too.
if you see Danvers, it's probably one of the because I just
Yeah, it's crazy. I have so many kayak movies in my garage, and it's like
if I had I would be making that one.
so that's the thing. Like Guardians really started as like drag tours and like on boathouse is what we're gonna do, and then like we started doing outreach to communities around the waterways, and they were like, fuck all of you guys know, which is like really true. Like a lot of drag tours are coming from the surrounding community. So Guardians kind of took a step back to like let's focus boathouse to be like let's focus on getting these communities to come to the water. Which is like, I think that's where the tension was going on too, because Guardians has taken a step back from like, let's build it right now, to like, wait, let's kind of cultivate the users in the community, you know?
Yeah, like, okay, well, we better get people out. A partnership with bands, where they have to run and coffee, or something to do with the water. But I know Aaron wanted to talk about they have
people think that
We do a lot of donations. We do a lot of
RA or
not our oysters, no. Oysters farming somewhere else. Self-sustaining oyster population.
At my secret is that
they're effectively useless, but they're very on Mondays, and then exactly the same event on Saturdays. That's Wednesday to Sunday. So those who are like super fast, especially this afternoon.
I do what I can.
That's our show. Monday and Saturday, lower lifts, you know, have fill up relatively There's no Mondays are much less popular. Oyster, that would be.
Congrats, Russians.
Thursday.
Maybe take off Friday.
The open call.
Yes. We were trying to make sense.
I think last year we about 25 partners that like citywide or functions for the party.
No way.
It's like a big
Who's actually got a suit?
Literally
You gotta love, there's nothing as terrifying as being in space for just like
For everything. Stem cells cure everything. Is there something it doesn't cure? No, it cures everything. And this is
I'll be there. Yeah, I would love for Matt and Eric to do some Super Saiyan hair. Yeah, it's like, I think so. The other sites. Oh, I am like pulled out now, so I don't have to do it after. That's all. Not sorry about it. Thank you. These are my friends. But there's a button to turn it on. You said there's a button. It looks like you can. Okay, yeah, okay, so there's no battery. Very generic. So does it mix or does it warm up the coffee? I think it's going to mix. Yeah. So I think in terms of the actual yeah, we know where I don't have is hold it and then pull out. Do you want to help? Firstly, like enough red matter.
No, I just I Google people who work on this standpoint.
Yeah, no. I don't know. Sorry. No.
11 o'clock.
Oh, thank God. Okay, so what we're going to do is pull on stuff.
But, you know, it'll be a nice flight.
Team meeting, Zoom salon, so much stuff. Pull this bad boy off. And then, we're going to pull the pipe towards you. We're going to pull the pipe towards you? Is that,
You know,
that means I'm getting fired.
a frenemy of mine is also a frenemy.
So you guys must be like screwed as well.
Great amount of production too. Really like do everything.
Okay. A lot of developers making it more money. But yeah, my major concern, like in terms of genetics, is trying to figure out the source. Like I said, in my talk here, at least it was 2 years ago, that there's no downstream cell of larvae. I don't know if that's true.
Also, kind of oyster question. You're not getting seed or getting larvae?
So seed larvae. So we put larvae in the tank and they're seed oysters basically. Seed.
I grew up working at oyster farm.
Oh, okay.
We bought seed, like half the seed.
No, so we buy
larvae are like horrible. They can't do anything.
It's really bad. So we buy larvae and we show them like basically seed directly into the tank onto the structures that we use now. We're looking at some direct seeding methods in some locations, like the terminal where there's not a lot of flow in around, really small basin. But primarily we're putting the larvae directly in the tank with so they're about seed size on the stack. And then outplanting at that size, so they're generally, I have to see it, but I would say like 5,
We're on opposite
not super big. So we're doing it in the summer. We will start setting so for the refalls, we start setting probably in about June. We give them a few weeks, and then we put them out before they're even like like they're very, very small and top 5 females in the OS program. They probably don't go out until they're about, I would say, somewhere between 10 and 30. They'll usually sit for about a year under our eco-dock. And then we'll call them because they're, I think that's the first. That was a great talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Because first year mortality is like 80%, right? Yeah. From larvae to the size. Which is like marine invertebrates, they're super high. And so we will wait for the oysters that go into these community engagement structures. After a year, we'll call them. So that we're only putting in shells with oysters on them. All the empty shells we'll take out. We might dump, we might reuse. And so those are technically bigger by the time they go out. Yeah, but if you are interested, yes, we're using carp. We are always interested in looking at more genetics.
If like if something comes up and gets me wants to do sequencing, I'd be happy to help.
Yeah.
And potentially, because I'm talking to kids at the end of this week about like classes they might want to teach, so I can see like a collaboration-ish thing, you know, if you guys could give us a sample.
Yeah.
Like even like uptown, downtown oysters, people love that kind of shit. You know what I mean? Like
the uptown, downtown rats?
Yeah.
I love that.
That's legit. That's very carbohydrate.
I know. You told me that, Paul. You're very into that.
Your face just lighted up.
Yeah, uptown, downtown rats. I love the rats. I'm a rat proponent, so
me too.
I get it. Sorry. I think that our choices either rats or cockroaches, and I would go
Absolutely.
So like
cockroaches is just meant to be flavored with rats.
Yeah, with rats. Exactly. Cockroach will land on you and people make you feel bad about it. So I'm like.
Have you seen Vegas Little Farm? It's a gem of a documentary about a like Santa Monica couple who decide to just like have their own farm that's like self-sustaining and no, they like buy farmland that's been like monocultured in California. The soil is completely they're from Santa Monica. They go and buy this monoculture, like completely the soil is completely fucked because it's just been all of this monoculture farm for decades. And they basically create like a self-sustaining, like cover crops, but like also just like every species like defending like its role and its right to be there. And like how the coyotes aren't pests, that they're actually like keeping the groundhogs under like all sorts of like it's wonderful, especially for anything. My stepdad's really into biodiversity and science, so we're very into that.
Interesting. Somebody asked you if there was a negative side to the oysters coming back. Do you get that question like ever?
No, it's really unusual.
It's a fair question.
I love, yeah. I think especially because like if you think about why would the DEC or the regulators feel that way about us putting too many oysters in?
One, just like breaking systems, continue to break it.
It makes no sense. So like, I'm sure you guys are fighting an uphill battle, and it makes very little logical sense sometimes.
I mean, I think the more work we do, the easier it gets. Just because they see results and
Once you get to 500 million oysters, it's gonna be wild.
Yeah,
exactly. That's what I'm saying.
A trillion after that.
And you guys are all like in the kind of like estuarial, littoral area, so like it's mostly state, right?
Yeah, we work in. I think we're working technically in 2 regions. Because up at the Tappan Zee is a separate region, I believe, than like the New York City, Long Island area. And of course, in the region, there are different regulations for like shellfishing, and that I think ties directly into like the amount of oysters of the water. There's a whole sorts of things. But yeah, it's a regulatory battle that I don't have to fight because I inherited a permit that works really well. Yeah, no, it's been great.
So are you full time with, may I say, Bob?
Yeah,
I love that. It's Bob.
Yeah,
it's so cool.
Yes, I am full time because I finished writing and I'll be but yeah, no, definitely. I think.
Well, just send an email. Just mention genomics, genetics, if something comes up, and maybe I'm probably Gen Space Friday. Because last time basically I just bought like anemones from like Carolina Scientific and people like sequence, but if we had something like local, and I'll give you guys a little bit of data and even like a little bit of pilot.
I mean, if you want to, I'd be happy to sequence. We could probably get you some fresher aquaculture oysters or some recruits to see what that looks like. But yeah, that'd be great. Sweet.
It would really be like one or two oysters. So
that's easy. Yeah, I have an allowance in our permit for up to 500 a year.
Oh, we could probably be free for you guys.
Oh yeah, that's great.
It's like Brooklyn fish people who like learn how to sequence and things. So yeah, you actually.
You are a Brooklyn type.
And you're a Brooklyn type.
Yeah. I'll come sequence some shit.
You actually enjoy that. You teach me how to do coding. Thanks again, Zeke. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
So nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you all for coming. It's been great.
This one's easy to put away. You guys have fun separating like
It would be I think they're going to be all separated. There are maybe I'm going maybe. We personally don't have many. Anyone wanted to? Yeah.
I bought a fishing camp. I don't fish. Yeah, I was the bomb. I said, okay, when I come back to this, it just seems like you guys can use the robot teaching how to do some drones and like landscape looks like. Come back, just everybody looks nice. Yeah. More money.
Yes, robot, like